Hello, 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 and welcome to a special edition of the Communicators, an interview series by Parisi. I'm Nick Connor, and this week we're thrilled to have Andrew Sangster join us to help us find out if the government has been a help or a hindrance to hospitality. Andrew is a former national news journalist with more than 3 decades of experience. He doesn't look that old. Focused on the hospitality industry. He now covers the wider operational real estate space and the growing hotelification of the property asset classes. As the owner and editorial director of Hotel Analyst, the leading news analyst service for the hospitality investors, he provides insights and context for decision makers across hotel and operational real estate. Through Hotel Analyst, he runs the Operational Real Estate Summit and the Hotel Industry Development Events, which brings together investors, owners, financiers, advisors, and innovators to explore the deals and trends shaping the future of the sector. Welcome, Andrew.
Great to be with you, Nick.
Now, we expect the government's Employees' Rights Bill to gain royal assent in the very near future. What does this mean to the hospitality sector?
Well, I think the fundamental takeaway, the most disappointing aspect of the whole bill is the government's failure to understand that adding risk adds cost, and somebody somewhere has to pay those costs. Now, it could be customers, it could be employers, could be employees, but those costs, as you layer on extra bureaucracy, that layers on extra cost. And they seem to think this is a free lunch, and it's not a free lunch, and they don't get that, I think. So there's a number of areas where I think there's real concern in the hospitality sector for the added complexity they are bringing. We've got more complexity around rostering. So we've already been hit in the hospitality sector by that increase in the national insurance contributions. We saw it in the last budget. So for somebody on £20,000, it's effectively a 50% increase in what an employer has to pay in terms of tax. It's a massive hit and has led to a significant cut in the number of people now employed in the sector. This, I'm afraid, is going to have a very similar effect. And just because there isn't pounds, shillings and pence attached to the actual act itself doesn't mean that the net impact is not going to be just as much. And in some ways, potentially, it could be even worse than that rise in NICs. So let's look at a couple of areas. One is this around flexible working. How can you possibly work from home in the hospitality sector? I mean, it's just bonkers. And this is going to create difficulties around rostering, all the extra rights you're handing over to employees. That's great, but somebody somewhere has to pay for that. Now, is that going to be the customer, employer? Employers are already up against it. They're going to be passing that on. Now, they're going to be passing it on in form of having fewer employees and putting up their prices to customers. We've got unnecessary...
So Andrew, so if I just kind of jump in that point, that's really interesting. So you're talking about, staff rotation and, sort of the real world implication. So what do you think? Are they going to be hiring less people? And if they do that, how are they going to run? Is this sort of the beginning of the dominoes? Is this where they're just going to start hiring less people, then they're not going to be able to function, and then the hotels are not going to exist? What's the real life scenario here?
Well, this is just an added bunch of pressure. We're already seeing the direct result of the pound, shillings and pence tax increases, potentially more to come in a month's time. But here, what this means is that if you make it harder to run your business, you make it more complex, you layer on more costs effectively in running your business, businesses at the margin will shut down and other businesses will put their prices up and or hire less staff. So that's the direct effect where that comes through. There's lots of things which seem nice to have here, but you do question how useful they're going to be. So for example, the pay gap report. So we've had these pay gap reports in terms of gender pay gap. We're now going to be seeing it in terms of race and in terms of disability. Well, best will in the world, I don't think those gender pay gap reports made a huge amount of difference in terms of that gender balance piece. And I don't see much difference coming from the race and disability piece. All it's doing is adding on more bureaucracy, more costs, and is actually, ironically, because hospitality is a great gateway employer, going to make it harder for women to get work, harder for people of colour to get work, and harder for disabled people to get work. So I think this is actually full of good intentions, but the unintended consequences are actually quite negative.
Yeah. So if you're a current hotel and you're looking at the staff and it looks tricky, but if you're, let's say, American investor looking to invest in like a new golf club in Scotland, is this going to put you off? I mean, you talk to investors all the day. What are the current conversations from those looking at UK hospitality as an asset?
So it gets factored in where it's clear and you can understand what's happening. Actually, that is better than having uncertainty. And some of the biggest problems this government is creating is uncertainty. They created uncertainty in the run up to last year's budget, and they're creating uncertainty again in the run up to this year's budget. And there's elements of uncertainty around this as well, because it's not being detailed enough, it's not being specified enough. So a lot of this where they're saying, well, what we're looking for is employers to demonstrate that they've made best endeavors not to be transgressors in all of these new rules that are coming in. But that's very wide open to interpretation, and it's going to depend on the type of tribunal you'll get on the day. So from an investor perspective, they factor that in. They're risk averse by nature. They will say, well, actually, that's adding to the costs. That puts the return hurdle up for that investment. And so they will just factor that in. Now, it won't kill all investments. That's ridiculous to assert that. But at the margin, it is going to lead to less investment. We saw that clearly with Brexit. As soon as that Brexit vote went through, everybody sat on their hands for years, and that was the biggest damage Brexit done, regardless of where you sit on that debate. But sitting on their hands, the uncertainty piece is what creates problems. And I don't think this government, alongside this risk piece, understands what they're doing, creating more uncertainty with their lack of clarity in what they're bringing.
And in plain English, lack of investment, what does that mean for jobs and
well, it means fewer
hotels?
jobs. It means lower. It means less tax. It means less growth. That's all the top and bottom of it. And it's what is the number one priority according to Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, according to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister? It's growth. Unfortunately, they're saying one thing and doing another thing. Because if it genuinely was their number one priority, I think they would have taken a pen to a lot of this and just crossed it out, because I think a lot of it's unnecessary. A lot of it isn't going to do what they think it's going to do, and it is going to lead to less investment.
So would you say, and I'll put it's a bit of a cheeky question here, would you say this is a good environment for the hospitality sector, particularly hotels, to grow in the UK right now? And if not, why?
Yeah, so the thing is, it's relative. Investment is a relative game. You're looking at the different options you have available. So certainly hospitality looks a lot more attractive than heavy industry, which is dependent on competitive energy prices, as an example. So hospitality does still look attractive. And overall, hospitality remains, if you're talking about an ugly baby contest, we're actually losing it, because we're one of the least ugly babies out there. The government ought to be focused on trying to make everybody more attractive, I think. Unfortunately, what they're doing is, at the moment we are getting clobbered, and we're getting clobbered in different areas, as I've sort of discussed already, in terms of the because we have our workforces at the lower end of the pay scale. So we've been clobbered by that NICS increase, that National Employer National Insurance contributions increase, which has impacted us significantly. And there are aspects in this bill as well, which are quite worrying, I think, which are somewhat hospitality specific. So if I might highlight one of the areas I've got a big concern with, which hasn't really been talked about a lot, but it's this notion again of putting more risk on employers. It's about workplace harassment. And you think, well, it's a good thing, right? Workplace harassment, nobody wants it, absolutely. And but we have existing laws that deal with most of this. But one of the key things in this new legislation is the idea of employers having to protect their staff from third-party harassment. So employers have an obligation to demonstrate they've done all that is reasonably possible to prevent third-party harassment. And again, you're in the lap of the gods as far as the Industrial Tribunal is concerned as to how they interpret that. As an employer, have you done enough? What's going to count as enough in terms of preventing that? So you could have a situation where somebody says something to some waiting staff, which is inappropriate, and the employer is then, a customer says that to the waiting staff, and the employer is then responsible for that. Now, how do you demonstrate that you've done all that is reasonably possible to prevent that? Have you got to put big signs up in all of our establishments, so racist and sexist and disablist and all the rest of it, comments will not be tolerated? Do we have to? It's not conducive for the greatest environment, I would suggest. And I'm not sure what that is directly going to be fixing either.
And do we know if they're going to, you say it's going to be through the tribunals, but do we know if the governments are going to give any guidelines? How are they going to interpret what is sort of abuse and what is, inappropriate behavior? Like you said, it's quite a broad range.
Yeah, well, neither of those are actually formally determined in this legislation. And they've just used that phrase, all reasonable attempts. So to demonstrate that you are not exposing your staff to third-party harassment. That is just so open-ended. That is a litigant's charter. That is my fear for this.
And if it's a litigant's charter, sort of like last question before we take a little break, but going back to how investors see it, do they cost this in, or is this sort of a big black swan because we just don't know what that means yet, and they can't factor in the costs of how long they're going to be spending in courts?
Well, they take a view, and they will have to take a view on it, but that view is going to be, well, this is an additional risk, therefore it has to move up the risk curve. So if you have more risk, you expect more reward. That means it's going to cost more. So for any given level of investment, they're going to expect a higher level of return. That means there's less money to go around. That means there's less money to put to work in terms of creating new jobs and growth for the economy. That's the real world we in business live in, which
and I guess
doesn't seem to register.
Well, that's it. And I guess by itself would be one thing. But as you mentioned before, it's the environment which is created, talk about national insurance increase. So do you think we're going down a spiral of having just a bad environment for not just hospitality, but anyone with sort of lower wage employees as majority of their workforce?
And yes, I mean it's become much harder, much higher risk to employ people, and it's much more costly to employ people at the lower end of the wage scale. And there's a number of things that this government ought to be thinking about where we can help them in terms of some of the challenges they have ahead, but all they seem to be doing is putting obstacles in the way of the hospitality sector at the moment. They're raising taxes, they're increasing the regulatory burden, and consequently, it makes things less attractive for investors. It means there's less money going to be put to work, creating jobs, creating wealth, creating new taxation streams.
Thanks, Andrew. So before we talk about what the government can do to help, I'd just like to take a moment to tell our listeners a bit more about Parisi. Parisi, we are specialists in communications, helping organizations achieve their commercial objectives, whether that's raising their profile, boosting revenue, or attracting new clients and investors, even in this current investor landscape Andrew's been telling about. We combine traditional PR and public affairs engagement with marketing and content-led strategies, focused on delivering the outcomes our clients need, not just ticking the boxes. Now, Andrew, let's pretend I'm a government minister and you have my full attention now. So pitch to me what the government could do and what it means to the UK economy if they take those actions.
I think the first thing to talk about is employment and the future of employment in our society and where those jobs of the future are going to come from. So if you look across the sectors, so you look at agriculture, employment now in the UK is less than 1% of the workforce. There's very little hope of that going up. Industry, it's now below 10% of the overall workforce and going down. You're not going to have more industrial jobs. I hope they do something about energy to make it more efficient, so we can, we've actually seen the gross value add of industry going down for the first time in the last couple of years in this country. That needs fixing, but it won't provide more jobs. It's important from an economic perspective, but not from an employment perspective. And if you look at the services sector, where hospitality sits, and you look at that, that's over 80% of employment now in the UK. It's critical, but most of that services sector is either going to flatline going forward, or it's going to decline. So if we look, if we break it into three component parts, so we'll look at those jobs which are funded by government, the public sector jobs. Well, we're sort of at breaking point in terms of taxation. So unless we're suddenly going to find that magic money tree, we're not going to be in a position to hire more people in the public sector. So that's kind of at best static, and I think you can make an argument that needs to be cut down. The second area is in terms of business services. So this is things like office jobs, it's also things like retail. Overall, that is not looking likely to be a big sector for future growth and employment. So retail is obviously suffering from e-commerce. E-commerce is currently about 30% of overall retail sales in the UK and growing. That is going to lead to ongoing decline in the retail sector. And we look at office jobs as a proxy. The big threat, well, we've had the work from home issue there in terms of office jobs, but I think the big threat is in terms of artificial intelligence, Gen AI, and the impact that's going to have on those knowledge workers. We're already seeing it a lot in terms of telesales and customer support operatives. Those are being scaled back as AI can deal with those sort of issues much more efficiently. But increasingly, we're going to see it in the professions as well, the accountants, the lawyers, where AI has a crucial role in boosting their productivity, but is likely to decrease the level of jobs. So we've got those two areas where I think, at best, they're going to be static. The only future area of growth for employment in our society is in the experience economy, of which hospitality is the bedrock. And that's the area. It's something that you're not going to replace most of the stuff we do in hospitality with AI bots. That human interaction piece, the craft skills of chefs. Now, it's going to become increasingly valuable. Those skills, those empathy skills that our front of house staff have, those skills that the chefs have in terms of those craft skills. And that's where the focus needs to be. And we need to think about how we're training people, what sort of education we're providing, but critically in terms of what we need to think about as an industry and how to power it forward, how to enable growth within it, rather than dismiss it. And that's the most frustrating thing I find when I talk to government officials, whether that's at national government level, whether it's at local government level. And it's not just the politicians. Often the politicians are some of the best at understanding this. Actually, some of the worst are the actual officials themselves. And they say, well, I talked to a chief executive of a council earlier this year, and she was adamant that she didn't want hospitality jobs. And she saw them as low paid, part-time work, and she'd much rather focus on things such as the electronics industry. I try and pin her down and say, well, how many jobs is the electronics industry going to be providing in your area? And she's in single digits at best with that, whereas hospitality is the biggest single private sector employer for her, and yet she was so dismissive of it. And this is a huge problem. It's a problem for us as a sector because we're not prioritized, but I think it's going to be a wider problem for society and for politicians as well.
Your argument is this, if I may summarize it, in the AI future, actually jobs and the jobs which normal people will have, it's likely to be in the hospitality sector. It's going to be one of the largest, if not the largest, employer of jobs, and particularly lower wage jobs as well.
And
which is an important message. So how does that mean for the regions? Why should West Midlands or another region look at hospitality? They invested into advanced manufacturing and robots building things. Is that your argument for it? This is a place where it's actually give you.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it builds on the crisis we have right now in terms of the 6.5 million people we have of working age on out of work benefits in this country. So proportionally, that level of unemployment, not officially classed as unemployment, but people who aren't in work and in receipt of benefits, that proportion is as high as the early 1990s, which was the worst recession in post-war history in terms of that level of labour which wasn't productively being used. And this is a crisis we have in our society. It's bad for those people who are languishing there on those benefits, and it's really bad for us having to pay for it as a society. And the best will in the world, you're not going to get those people into some advanced manufacturing job where you need a few PhDs. It's entry-level jobs. It's the sort of jobs we do in hospitality that's going to enable those people to get back into the workforce where they want to be and where we as society want them to be. And we need to focus on that. And we've got a situation where some parts of the country, 1 in 5 people, they're in completely workless households. It's shocking. I mean, it's deeply shocking, and this is entrenched through generations now.
So let me be devil's advocate, Andrew. I'm the government. I have a huge black hole I need to fill. I'm not going to be lowering taxes. This employment rights bill, for lots of complicated reasons with the Labour Party, it's going through Parliament. It's common law. We can't change that.
No.
So what maybe 3 or 1 thing the government can do to help encourage greater employment and investments, so people open more hotels and we can employ more people? What are the sort of the key things you want to see from government in the real world? And let's say we can look at targeted things, but there is no money to give. The employment rights bill is coming through, so yeah.
What are the levers the government can pull? It's tax and it's regulation. And don't put up regulation, don't put up tax. That's the simple message. And what have they been doing? They've been putting up tax. We've just talked about the employer NIC situation. But we've also got a huge issue with business rates, which are skyrocketing, and it's really challenging. And it's quite unfair from a hospitality perspective. It's encouraging people to stay at home because it's so much harder for hospitality out of home premises to compete because of this huge tax that is being paid in terms of business rates. So it's making it harder to employ people within hospitality because of this disproportionately large increase on the part-time and lower waged employees within hospitality, and we've got this extra tax in terms of the venues as well. So let's just take a step back and think about how we can grow this industry. And what enables, it's 101 of capitalist society. What do you need to do? You have to increase capital to be able to then deploy that in investment. Well, one of the big things that this government has done is in terms of the inheritance tax rules, now means people can't pass their businesses on. It means effectively that businesses will either be sold off, broken up and sold off, or they'll be struggling under an enormous tax pile which they've got to pay off, which will prevent them expanding, prevent them employing more people. So this is very ill thought out, because that capital accumulation allows the industry to grow. And these family-owned businesses, they're the bedrock of the hospitality sector. It's a very fragmented sector. We've got only a handful of big companies. I mean, if you look at the two giants we have listed on the stock market in the FTSE 100, it's Whitbread and it's Intercontinental Hotels Group. They're in the bottom quartile of the listing. They're relatively small businesses. Part of the reason I suspect government never listens to us, part of the reason government just wants to ignore us, because the big pharmaceutical companies, the big energy companies, they actually can get a hearing in government. So it's harder to get that message through, I suspect, because we're so fragmented, and being so broken up enables, frankly, a bit of bullying to go on by government, and they're just not thinking through the implications of this. If you want to regenerate some of the hardest hit areas of our country, where we've got the more than 1 in 5 people in out of work benefits, hospitality ought to be the spearhead of that.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I've been Nick Connor, and you've been listening to The Commentators, an interview series by Parisi. If you have any questions for us or Andrew, drop them in the comments. And don't forget to give the Parisi LinkedIn page a like. Be sure to tune in next time. Thank you.